Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Benjamin, 27, and I've always been the responsible one in my family. The one who cleans up messes, the one who never complains, the one who silently absorbs everyone else's drama while pretending it doesn't bother me. Growing up, I thought it was just my nature to be patient, to let things slide, and to keep the peace. But lately, that patience has been wearing thinner than the soles of my favorite sneakers. I've realized that in a family like mine, being responsible often just makes you a target for everyone else's entitlement. My mom, my dad, and my sister have always had this unspoken hierarchy where I'm last on the list for anything fun or rewarding. It's subtle at first, a sarcastic comment here, a dismissive eye roll there. But over the years, it's piled up into this constant pressure that no one outside the family could ever understand. And this summer, it seems like they decided to make it official. It all started with a text in our family group chat, which I had been trying to ignore because, frankly, it's mostly just a place for them to vent at me or one another. My phone buzzed, and there it was, a string of messages that felt like a punch to the gut all at once. "We're going on vacation without you or the kids this summer," my mom wrote. I stared at it for a solid 10 seconds, rereading it like maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Vacation without me? Without my niece and nephew? It sounded more like an announcement than a conversation, and the casual cruelty stung worse than I thought it would. Before I even had time to react, my sister chimed in, clearly having read my mom's message and decided to pile on. "But make sure you keep the house clean while we're gone." Then my dad, almost like a cherry on top of this passive-aggressive sundae, added, "Oh, and don't forget to feed the pets." I didn't reply, not because I wasn't furious, but because I needed a second to process the sheer absurdity of it. My family had never been subtle, but this was something new. I could almost hear their collective smirks through the screen. The message didn't just sting, it hit deeper because it wasn't even hidden in disguise. I was expected to act like their personal housekeeper and pet sitter while they went off to enjoy themselves, presumably laughing about how responsible Benjamin would hold down the fort. And I hated to admit it, but for a moment, I felt that familiar pang of resentment, that simmering anger I had buried under years of forced smiles and polite nods. I had spent my mornings running errands for them, afternoons cleaning up after everyone, and evenings trying to maintain some semblance of a life that wasn't entirely dictated by my family's whims. And yet here I was, being treated like a fixture in their lives, something permanent and useful, but never someone they needed to include in their plans or care about in any meaningful way. It wasn't the first time I'd been sidelined, but it was the first time the slight was so blatant. My sister has always been the one to get attention, the one whose opinions mattered, the one whose plans took precedence. She's 3 years younger than me, which makes it even more ridiculous. She's always been able to bend our parents to her will, and I've spent most of my life watching it happen, helpless, frustrated, and furious. I sat there staring at my phone, scrolling up through the chat to see if I had missed some sort of context that might soften the blow. There was none. The previous messages were about dinner plans and some minor family errands, all of which revolved around my sister's schedule or my mom's whims. I realized then that this wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a joke, it wasn't a momentary lapse in thoughtfulness. This was intentional. This was a pattern they'd perfected over the years, and now they were testing just how much I would take before finally snapping, or before I accepted that this was my role forever. I could feel the familiar knot of frustration in my stomach, the one that builds when someone pushes your patience past the limit but knows exactly how to do it without giving you an excuse to lash out. I imagined my mom and sister probably sitting together in the living room, laughing and making plans, while my dad nodded along, pleased with himself for delegating all the boring work to me. The thought of them packing bags, making lists, and getting excited while I stayed home, scrubbing floors and feeding pets, made my blood boil quietly. I kept picturing the scene again and again, as if replaying it might give me some kind of insight into how I had ended up here, or maybe just to let the anger simmer longer. I tried to tell myself to stay calm. After all, I'm not the type to cause scenes, or at least, I hadn't been, not until now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this time, I didn't have to stay silent. For years, I'd been the responsible one, the one who took the brunt of their entitlement with a polite smile. But as I stared at that chat, something shifted inside me. I didn't want to just stew silently anymore. I wanted them to see, to really understand, that I wasn't invisible, that I wasn't just a cog in their little family machine. And for the first time in a long time, I started thinking about how I might make that happen. It wasn't just about being left out. It wasn't just about cleaning the house or feeding the pets while they lounged on a beach somewhere. It was about respect, or the lack thereof. It was about years of being treated like a backup option, like someone whose time and effort were valuable only when convenient. I felt the familiar surge of indignation, the one I've learned to channel carefully, because my family responds poorly to confrontation. But this time, I didn't feel like holding back. I wanted them to see the consequences of treating me like I was disposable. I wanted to remind them, in a way they couldn't ignore, that I had agency, that I had a voice, and most importantly, that I could make my own rules in this family, rather than following theirs blindly. I spent the next few minutes thinking through options. Ignoring them would feel satisfying in a small, temporary way, but I needed more than that. A text, a phone call, a passive reply, they wouldn't suffice. I needed leverage, something that would disrupt their little vacation fantasy and make them reconsider their automatic assumption that I would play servant without question. I could hear their voices in my head, my mom's patronizing tone, my sister's smug laugh, my dad's indifferent shrug. Each of them was so used to getting what they wanted without effort. But not this time. Not this summer. I needed to plan carefully, because my family might underestimate me, but that doesn't mean I couldn't outmaneuver them. And then I started thinking about the logistics. Their vacation was 3 weeks away. Plenty of time to prepare. I thought about my sister's favorite outfits, the routines my mom insisted upon, the exact schedule my dad had been counting on for feeding the pets and maintaining the house. I realized I had all the information I needed to make a point that would be slow, calculated, and impossible for them to ignore. I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but the seed of it had been planted. I could almost feel it growing inside me, that mix of anticipation and quiet rage that fuels careful, deliberate plans. By the time I put my phone down, I knew one thing for certain. This summer would not go according to their plan. For the first time, I wasn't just the responsible one. I was the one with the power to make them think twice, to make them understand, without a word, that taking me for granted came with consequences. And even though I didn't know exactly how it would unfold yet, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a thrill at the idea of finally asserting myself, quietly but unmistakably, in a family that had always assumed I would stay in my place. I took a deep breath and went into the kitchen, staring at the neatly stacked dishes, the spotless counters, the quiet hum of a house that was about to become a stage for something I had been imagining for weeks. My mind raced with possibilities, each more precise and satisfying than the last. For once, I wasn't imagining their disappointment. I was imagining their shock, their frustration, their inability to predict what I was about to do. And somehow, that felt like freedom. The next few days were a blur of irritation and simmering anger. I tried to go about my normal routine, work, errands, cooking, cleaning, but every little interaction with my family reminded me of how invisible I was, and how they seemed to expect me to disappear into the background whenever it suited them. My sister was on a roll, full of energy, planning her vacation wardrobe, checking online for activities, and even posting pictures of potential hotel rooms in the family group chat, as if I wasn't part of the family at all. Every time I saw her glowing smile in those pictures, I felt that same knot in my stomach tighten. She didn't just get attention, she demanded it, and everyone bent to her whims without a second thought. My mom was worse. She started calling me Benjamin, sweetie, don't forget, for everything, even things I had already done. Benjamin, sweetie, don't forget to check the locks before we leave. Benjamin, sweetie, make sure you water the plants. Every time she said it, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and anger wash over me. She was acting like I was both incapable and obligated at the same time, a human tool that she could assign tasks to at her convenience. And my dad, ever the silent enabler, would nod along, muttering, "Yeah, that's right. Make sure it's all done," like my mom's instructions were some divine decree and I was only there to obey. It was all so frustratingly familiar, and yet somehow sharper this time, more blatant, more impossible to ignore. I tried to keep my cool, tried to rationalize it in my head. Maybe they were just excited, I told myself. Maybe this was normal family behavior. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. I knew that the way I was treated was unfair, that years of favoritism toward my sister had created a pattern of entitlement that had only intensified over time. And yet, even knowing that, I couldn't shake the creeping feeling of helplessness that had always accompanied these situations. Until, that is, it happened. The moment that finally pushed me past the breaking point. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had spent the morning cleaning the kitchen, doing laundry, and organizing the living room. I was exhausted, but tried to take a moment to sit down with a cup of coffee, thinking maybe I could just breathe for 5 minutes before diving into dinner prep. That's when my sister walked in, her phone glued to her hand, eyes scanning something on the screen. I tried to ignore her at first, but the conversation was impossible to miss. "Oh my God, Mom, you will not believe this," she said, her voice dripping with excitement. "Look at this deal I just got for the resort. We could totally upgrade our room for free if we book now." My mom's laugh followed immediately, high-pitched and indulgent, while my dad made a low, approving hum from the corner of the room. "Wow, that sounds amazing, honey," my mom said, leaning over my sister's shoulder as she scrolled through the screen. "Benjamin, you're still handling dinner tonight, right?" I froze. I was standing just a few feet away, holding the coffee mug like it was some kind of shield, and yet they were completely oblivious to my presence. My sister didn't even look at me. She was too busy bouncing on her heels, excited about the vacation. My mom's voice was like a needle in my chest, calm, polite, but loaded with the assumption that I existed solely to serve them. Yeah, dinner's fine," I said, my voice flat. I wanted to be invisible, but I also wanted them to hear the edge in my tone, the warning beneath the calm. "Oh good," my mom said, smiling sweetly. "Don't forget to set the table early. We don't want to interrupt your work schedule." My sister snickered at that, like it was the funniest joke in the world. My dad just nodded, looking pleased with the arrangement. And that's when it hit me. I realized they weren't just dismissing me. They were taking pleasure in it. They were actively enjoying the knowledge that I was going to spend my time catering to their lives while they planned theirs. And the kicker, the moment that truly broke something inside me, came when my sister said, "Oh, and Ben, don't even think about asking to come along. You know how Mom feels about it." I felt my chest tighten so much I thought I might actually choke. It wasn't just a text or a minor comment. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. They had made it clear. I was excluded, invisible, a secondary character in the story of their lives. All the years of subtle dismissal, of being ignored, of watching my sister get everything I wanted and more, came flooding back. I felt anger, but also betrayal, deep and stinging. This wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. And it was intentional. I retreated to my room, slamming the door just enough to make my point without provoking a scene. I sat on my bed, my hands gripping the edge like I could physically hold myself together. I replayed the conversation in my head, over and over, each repetition sharpening the sting. Every polite smile, every sarcastic remark, every expectation they had ever piled on me suddenly made sense as a long-running pattern of control. And for the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it, not just anger, but sadness, frustration, and disbelief. I stayed in my room for hours, thinking, analyzing, trying to decide how I could respond. I knew I couldn't react impulsively. That would just feed them, let them think they had won. I needed a plan, something calculated, something that would make them recognize, without a doubt, that their treatment of me had consequences. I started making lists in my notebook, small ways to test them, ways to subtly push back, ways to reclaim some sense of agency. Maybe I'd leave something unfinished or rearrange their little vacation plans in harmless ways. The point wasn't to ruin their trip. It was to remind them that I wasn't just their invisible helper, their afterthought. But even as I plotted, the betrayal lingered in my mind. It wasn't just the exclusion or the demands or the constant favoritism. It was the knowledge that they didn't even see me as part of the family in any meaningful sense. They could plan, laugh, and celebrate without me. They could assume I'd handle everything at home without even asking if I wanted to be involved. And they did it with such confidence, such certainty, that I realized the extent to which I had been underestimated all my life. That night, dinner was the hardest part. My sister was bubbly, recounting her online finds, showing my mom the vacation itinerary, while my dad nodded along, making approving comments. I sat at the table, silent, carefully plating my own food as if nothing had happened. Every bite felt like an act of defiance. I didn't speak. I didn't react. I just ate, keeping my thoughts to myself while they celebrated a future that I wasn't allowed to be part of. And then came the real shock, the moment that confirmed my worst fears about them. The moment I realized that the betrayal wasn't just emotional or symbolic, but concrete. My mom, in her usual sweet, caring tone, turned to me mid-meal and said, "Oh, Benjamin, by the way, we decided to hire someone to take care of the pets while we're gone. We thought it would be better than bothering you." I froze mid-bite. The knife in my hand felt heavier than it should have. The words hit like a physical blow. All that planning I had imagined, all that preparation I had done to hold the house together, they hadn't even considered me necessary. I was completely replaceable. My sister's grin widened as she added, "Yeah, we figured you'd want to relax too. You know, since you work so hard." My dad nodded solemnly, pleased with the decision, completely missing the irony of their words. I felt something inside me crack, a mixture of rage, humiliation, and disbelief. The person who had spent decades being the responsible one, the one who had silently held everything together, was now irrelevant. And just like that, I understood that nothing short of something drastic would make them see me, not as a servant, not as an afterthought, but as someone who had boundaries, agency, and the ability to act. I sat there, staring at my plate, the room spinning slightly with the force of my emotions. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what might happen if I didn't just endure it, if I didn't just silently play my role. The idea of taking control, of turning the tables in a way that would make them understand, really understand, what it felt like to underestimate me, began to form. But I also knew I had to wait, had to plan, had to ensure that when the moment came, it was undeniable, unmissable, and unarguable. I excused myself from the table without a word and went back to my room. I closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a long breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. This wasn't just about the vacation anymore. It wasn't even about the house or the pets. This was about respect. This was about finally asserting myself in a family that had always taken me for granted. And for the first time, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could finally make them see me, not as Benjamin the invisible, the responsible, the replaceable, but as someone who could no longer be ignored. The days after the vacation announcement felt like walking through molasses. Every interaction with my family reinforced the fact that they had no intention of treating me as anything other than invisible labor, a background fixture, or a placeholder for their convenience. I found myself moving through the motions, cleaning, cooking, and tending to the pets, all while they planned, booked, and excitedly discussed the trip that didn't include me. At first, I tried to make sense of it, to rationalize their behavior, to believe that maybe they simply hadn't considered my feelings. But the truth was unavoidable. This was intentional. They had spent decades conditioning me to accept the role they'd designed for me, and now they were capitalizing on it, taking it to its logical extreme. I started avoiding the family group chat, muting notifications, and retreating into my room more often. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart sank, not from anxiety, but from the sheer weight of anticipation, wondering which directive, which subtle insult, which reminder of my expendability would appear next. I realized with growing clarity that I had been living for them, molding my life around their preferences, while mine had been quietly dismissed for years. It was a painful realization, one that left me feeling hollow, frustrated, and, honestly, a little hopeless. The breaking point came on a Wednesday. I had been doing laundry when my sister burst into my room, holding her phone like it was a trophy. "Mom says you better get the yard done before we leave," she announced, grinning like it was a joke. "And don't forget to trim the bushes exactly like she showed you last year. We don't want any mistakes." Her tone was teasing, but the message behind it was crystal clear. I existed solely to anticipate and fulfill their desires, and if I didn't, there would be consequences in the form of guilt tripping, passive aggressiveness, or outright scorn. I wanted to scream, to throw her phone across the room, to tell her exactly what I thought of her smug sense of entitlement. But instead, I did the one thing I had learned over the years to master. I forced a smile, nodded, and walked out. Inside, though, a storm was raging. I felt exhausted, trapped, and insignificant, like I was drowning in a life that had never been mine to begin with. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was always going to be the family's invisible servant, always going to be the one left behind, while everyone else chased fun, recognition, and validation. For the first time in years, I let myself feel utterly defeated. I didn't just feel angry. I felt invisible, unimportant, and, worst of all, replaceable. The realization that my hard work and dedication had been met with indifference and dismissal for so long hit harder than I expected. I questioned myself constantly. Why did I allow this? Why did I let them dictate my sense of worth? And for the first time, I confronted the truth I had been avoiding for years. My family didn't see me as a person with feelings, ambitions, or limits. They saw me as a function, a tool, a cog in their convenient little system. That night, I cried in silence, not just for the vacation, not just for the neglect, but for years of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. It was a cathartic release, a reckoning with the invisible weight I had carried for so long. I realized that if I continued on this path, I would remain trapped in their system indefinitely, defined by their whims and expectations rather than my own choices. And yet, in that despair, something unexpected began to form, a seed of defiance, tiny but persistent, that whispered I didn't have to stay broken. I started thinking, in small, careful steps, about what life might look like if I put myself first for once. I began to imagine a version of myself who wasn't the background character in my family's narrative, but the author of my own story. At first, these were fleeting thoughts, almost too fragile to hold on to, but they grew more persistent, more insistent, like a quiet drumbeat beneath the chaos of my life. The next morning, I decided to reclaim a small piece of control. I started with minor changes, making breakfast for myself instead of everyone else, going for long walks during hours they expected me to be at their beck and call, even taking a few evenings off from housework to focus on personal projects I had long neglected. Each small act felt revolutionary. It was like discovering muscles I hadn't known I possessed, muscles of independence, self-worth, and personal boundaries. I realized I had spent so long responding to my family's demands that I had forgotten what it felt like to act solely for myself. Slowly, I began rebuilding a sense of identity that had nothing to do with them. I signed up for a few courses I'd been putting off, started exercising regularly, not because anyone told me to, but because I wanted to feel stronger, more capable. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, people who treated me as a person rather than an obligation. I even started exploring hobbies I had abandoned, like painting and writing, which had once brought me joy but had been overshadowed by years of caretaking. Each small victory, each reclaiming of time and attention, felt like a quiet rebellion, a way of asserting my worth in a family that had long denied it. And then came the first tangible signs of change in their perception, though they didn't recognize it as such. When I politely declined to reorganize the living room for the third time that week, my mom's smile faltered. When I spent an afternoon painting in the backyard instead of trimming the bushes to her exact specifications, my sister's teasing turned into something sharper, more suspicious. And when I started refusing to take on extra tasks they had previously assumed were mine, my dad's approval no longer accompanied his nods. Instead, there was tension, a barely concealed frustration. I realized with quiet satisfaction that their confidence in my compliance had begun to waver. I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. On one hand, asserting myself against a family that had conditioned me for compliance was terrifying. I had no idea how far they might push back, or what lengths they might go to in order to maintain control. On the other hand, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. For the first time, I was acting deliberately, not reactively, shaping my own reality instead of responding to theirs. It was intoxicating, empowering, and deeply satisfying, even in small doses. By the end of that week, I had made significant progress in quietly reclaiming my life. I hadn't yet confronted them directly, nor had I revealed any of the plans forming in my mind. But I felt stronger, more confident, and more aware of my own value. I realized that for the first time in years, I was no longer their invisible servant. I was Benjamin, the one who could act, decide, and assert boundaries. I was learning that my power didn't come from confrontation alone, but from the deliberate, patient cultivation of independence and self-worth. Yet, despite these personal victories, the shadow of betrayal still lingered. Their smug indifference, the blatant favoritism toward my sister, the expectation that I exist solely for their convenience, all of it remained, like a dark cloud hanging over every interaction. I knew that reclaiming my life quietly was only the first step. There was still a larger reckoning coming, something that would require careful planning, patience, and strategy. I couldn't just rebuild myself in isolation. I had to prepare for the inevitable moment when my family's entitlement would collide with my newfound strength. And then, as if on cue, the first real spark of that collision appeared. My sister had been bragging to her friends about the upcoming vacation, completely unaware, or deliberately ignoring, the fact that I had begun taking steps to assert myself. My mom called me that evening with a list of chores that had suddenly doubled, framed as helpful suggestions, while my dad looked on approvingly. I realized in that moment that they still underestimated me, believed I would continue to comply without question, and assumed that my newfound independence was fragile enough to crumble under pressure. But I had changed. I had tasted the possibility of control, of personal agency, of standing on my own terms. That night, lying in bed, I felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. I knew the next steps had to be deliberate. I couldn't rush. I couldn't let emotions dictate my actions. I had to be strategic, methodical, and patient. The betrayal, the exclusion, the entitlement, they had all laid the groundwork for what was coming. And for the first time, I truly understood that the slow, quiet rise I was experiencing wasn't just about reclaiming my life. It was about preparing to take back everything they had taken for granted, to make them confront the consequences of underestimating me for so long. I closed my eyes, a plan slowly forming in my mind, layer by layer, like a blueprint for something monumental. I didn't yet know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew one thing. My family would no longer see me as someone to be ignored, dismissed, or taken advantage of. And that knowledge, fragile and exhilarating as it was, made the long nights of frustration, betrayal, and self-doubt suddenly feel like the necessary prelude to something far bigger. Something powerful, something inevitable. If I wanted to truly make my family understand, I needed a plan, something precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. I had spent years reacting to their entitlement, silently absorbing their favoritism, and accommodating their whims. Now it was my turn to dictate the terms, to turn the tables, and to make them see, finally, that I was neither invisible nor replaceable. But I also knew patience was crucial. Rushing in would ruin the effect, alert them to my intentions too soon, and they would find ways to undermine me before the moment arrived. It started with observation. I became almost surgical in tracking their routines, habits, and expectations. I noted my mom's obsessive attention to detail, how she expected the house to look perfect at all times. I observed my sister's patterns, her reliance on everyone else for last-minute favors, her assumption that she was always the center of attention. I even took mental notes on my dad's predictable indulgence, how he never questioned anyone's actions, yet silently approved when tasks were delegated to me. Every word, gesture, and habit became data, a way to understand the exact levers I could pull to disrupt their sense of control. At the same time, I started quietly building my own little support network. Friends I had lost touch with over the years suddenly became invaluable. I reached out under casual pretenses, reconnecting over coffee, shared memories, and mutual support. I didn't explicitly explain my plan, but I found that just talking about the family, the patterns of entitlement and exclusion, elicited reactions that reinforced my sense of clarity. They listened, they validated, and more importantly, They reminded me that the way my family treated me wasn't normal. That outside perspective fueled a growing confidence, a quiet certainty that I could finally act without fear. I also began reclaiming my space at home in subtle but deliberate ways. I reorganized rooms in ways that made daily chores easier for me, but slightly disrupted the flow my family was used to. I planted flowers in unusual arrangements, moved furniture to positions that maximized efficiency for me, and even rearranged the pantry so that retrieving anything took a slightly different rhythm than my mom had expected. To anyone else, these changes would seem minor or even inconsequential, but to my family, who thrived on control and predictability, the slightest deviation could be unsettling. It was a way of reminding them, quietly, that I was no longer their passive fixture. The next stage was timing. I knew their vacation was just over a month away, and I realized that this window was perfect. Any action I took too early would give them time to adapt, to manipulate, to regain control. Any action I took too late would feel reactive, like I had been forced into it. I needed a moment when the stakes were highest, when their confidence was at its peak, and when they assumed I would be entirely compliant. That moment would ensure maximum impact, an unmistakable statement that I had reclaimed authority in a household that had long underestimated me. While observing and planning, I also began testing boundaries. Small acts at first, leaving minor chores incomplete, offering subtle suggestions that contradicted their preferences, politely refusing unnecessary tasks. Each time, I watched their reactions closely. My sister would frown, her smug confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. My mom would give a tight smile, her eyes flicking toward my dad for silent approval. And my dad, well, he would usually shrug, but there was always a momentary hesitation, as if the invisible scaffolding of authority they had relied on for decades had been shaken. These minor victories fueled my resolve. Every small success built momentum, and with momentum came courage. I started envisioning the final outcome. In my mind, I could see their faces, the exact expressions of shock, frustration, and disbelief as they realized their carefully orchestrated vacation and expectations had been subtly undermined. I didn't want chaos. I wanted control. I didn't want anger. I wanted comprehension. I wanted them to understand, without ambiguity, that I was no longer someone to be taken for granted. It wasn't revenge for the sake of cruelty. It was a lesson, a demonstration, and a reclamation of self-respect all rolled into one. Meanwhile, I quietly gathered practical tools. I made lists, mapped schedules, and even researched legal and logistical steps for managing the house in a way that could surprise them without causing irreversible damage. I documented their predictable routines, timed their errands, and noted the minutiae of their preferences. This wasn't obsessive, it was preparation. Preparation to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no excuses, no wiggle room, and no chance for them to dismiss the impact of my actions. During this period, I also strengthened my emotional resilience. I spent evenings reflecting on the years of dismissal, entitlement, and favoritism, not to wallow, but to internalize lessons and fuel determination. I reminded myself constantly, I wasn't powerless, I wasn't invisible, and I wasn't defined by their treatment of me. Every slight, every exclusion, every casual remark had become data, insight, and motivation. I allowed myself brief moments of anger, but I channeled that energy into planning rather than confrontation. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was acting deliberately, with intention and foresight. I also began imagining possible obstacles. My family was unpredictable, often resorting to guilt, manipulation, or even subtle threats to regain control. I needed contingencies. I considered how they might respond to deviations in household routines, missed chores, or shifts in daily schedules. I mapped out likely reactions, then mentally rehearsed ways to stay calm, maintain control, and continue executing my plan without tipping my hand. It was meticulous work, almost like strategy chess. Each piece moved deliberately, each action calculated for maximum effect. And then, one evening, the perfect opportunity presented itself. My mom and sister were engrossed in planning, reading reviews, comparing hotels, and plotting excursions, completely absorbed in their world without a thought for me. My dad was at his usual post, silently approving everything, unaware that the scaffolding of their authority was beginning to wobble. I watched them, a sense of clarity and resolve settling in my chest. All the preparation, the observation, the quiet reclamation of my agency had led to this point. I didn't yet act, but I knew that when I did, it would be decisive. That night, lying in bed, I reviewed my mental blueprint for the 1000th time. The timing was right. My plan was detailed, layered, and subtle enough to keep them guessing while ensuring the outcome I wanted. I thought about the look on their faces when they realized that I was no longer a passive participant in their lives, when they saw that every expectation, every assumption, every slight and exclusion they had imposed on me would meet with consequences. For the first time, the sense of anticipation was almost overwhelming, but it wasn't fear. It was excitement, focus, and the unshakable certainty that the next move would be mine. I closed my eyes and let the scenario play out in my head. My mom frantically checking lists, my sister fuming over inconveniences that seemed minor but were symbolic, my dad helplessly trying to intervene while their confidence crumbled. Every tiny detail had been accounted for, every contingency mapped, every move carefully orchestrated. And the best part? They had no idea it was coming. This was no longer just about asserting boundaries. It was no longer just about reclaiming control of my life. This was about proving to them, in the most undeniable way possible, that I was no longer the invisible, compliant Benjamin they had relied on for decades. I was the one setting the rules now. And when the day came, when the first domino fell, they would see what it truly meant to underestimate me. I drifted to sleep that night with a strange sense of peace, knowing the next steps were mine to take. I had observed, prepared, and quietly reclaimed pieces of my life. I had allies, strategies, and momentum. All that remained was execution. And when that moment came, I knew the outcome would be satisfying, inevitable, and unforgettable for them and for me. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, and the family who had once dismissed me as invisible would finally realize exactly who I was. The day finally arrived. My family was buzzing with excitement over the vacation, completely oblivious to the storm quietly building in the background. I had been careful, methodical, deliberate in every step leading up to this moment. Weeks of preparation, observation, subtle boundary setting, and quiet defiance had culminated in this exact scenario. I had calculated every detail, the timing, the logistics, the expectations, and the psychological pressure points. I wasn't angry in a reactive sense. I was calm, composed, and more aware of my own power than I had ever been in my life. It began with small, seemingly insignificant adjustments that I had planted over the past weeks. The pantry was reorganized, but in a way that made retrieving ingredients a slow, deliberate process. The cleaning schedule was subtly altered so that chores they assumed were finished on time were now perfectly out of sync with their plans. The pets had been given a slightly different routine, one that would require attention at precisely the wrong moments if they assumed I would handle everything without fail. These tiny, carefully executed changes were invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely, but they set the stage for the perfect disruption. I greeted my family that morning with a quiet smile, calm and measured, giving no hint of the chaos to come. My mom was frantically checking her lists. My sister was bouncing between her phone and her suitcase, and my dad was offering absent-minded advice, confident that everything was under control. They didn't see me as a threat. They didn't anticipate that I had transformed over the past month from a background character to the one quietly directing the flow of events. And that underestimation was key. The first ripple came when my sister attempted to grab her packed suitcase from the closet. She froze mid-step, blinking at the new arrangement. The bags she had so carefully laid out were subtly blocked by other items I had shifted into place, forcing her to pause, rearrange, and adjust her plans. My mom, noticing the hesitation, began offering frantic, helpful suggestions, which were easily deflected by my calm and deliberate reminders that the new setup was optimized for efficiency, a subtle inversion of the usual dynamic where I had always been the one at her beck and call. Next came the pantry. My mom had asked me to make breakfast for everyone before they left. Normally, I would have moved like clockwork, preparing coffee, toast, and eggs while fielding simultaneous instructions and corrections. But this time, I intentionally timed every step differently, deliberately slowing the process. The cereal boxes were stacked in a way that required extra effort to reach. The coffee machine was preset with a slightly inconvenient configuration, and the eggs were carefully placed in a section that necessitated an extra reach for someone in a hurry. When my mom realized her routine was disrupted, she muttered under her breath, frustrated, while my sister glanced at her phone, confused by the subtle inefficiency. My calm demeanor only heightened their irritation because nothing about me looked out of place. I was smiling politely, making no excuses, yet everything they expected to happen seamlessly was quietly, undeniably off-kilter. By mid-morning, tension had built exponentially. My sister's phone pinged constantly as she attempted to coordinate last-minute activities, but the minor adjustments I had made in their packing arrangements and household setup caused delays that made her flustered, increasingly agitated, and visibly rattled. My mom, normally in control of every minor detail, was now scrambling to adjust, trying to micromanage tasks that had previously required no attention. My dad, seeing the growing chaos, attempted to offer solutions, but his usual nonchalance faltered as he realized that what he assumed would be simple delegation was now slightly, but persistently, off. Then came the pets. I had adjusted their feeding schedule, subtly altering the timing of meals and walks to coincide with moments my family had set aside for packing, checking reservations, and other pre-trip activities. It wasn't chaotic enough to be noticed immediately, but the cumulative effect of minor frustrations began to cascade, producing moments of exasperation and minor conflict. My sister snapped once, muttering under her breath, "Why is this happening now? This isn't supposed to be this hard." My mom tried to interject, only to be interrupted by another small misalignment I had orchestrated. Even my dad looked unsettled, realizing that his quiet assumption that I would handle everything flawlessly had been upended. By noon, the house was in controlled chaos. Not destructive, not dangerous, but disruptive enough to fracture their confidence. The shift in power was palpable. For the first time, they weren't in command. They were reacting. They were struggling to maintain the illusion of control, and it was entirely because I had refused to play the role they had assigned me for decades. I was patient, calm, and deliberate, offering polite suggestions when asked, never raising my voice, but letting the natural consequences of my careful adjustments do the work. The final stroke came when my mom, frustrated beyond measure, attempted to issue a series of last-minute instructions. Normally, I would have complied without question, executing every minor detail while maintaining a calm exterior. But this time, I politely declined, citing the new system I had set up, which was already optimized for efficiency. She attempted to argue, to guilt-trip me, but I remained firm, composed, and unshakable. My sister tried to intervene, but I subtly referenced the rearrangements I had made earlier, pointing out the efficiency benefits in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. My dad, trying to restore order, realized he couldn't impose authority where none existed, because for the first time, I wasn't yielding. The crescendo came as they realized the extent of my quiet revolution. Every expectation they had placed on me for the vacation had been subtly, but irrevocably, altered. My calm, methodical adjustments had turned their world upside down without a single angry confrontation. Their frustration boiled into disbelief as they recognized that I was no longer the invisible servant. They had assumed compliance, but what they faced instead was competence, confidence, and agency that could not be ignored. And then came the moment I had anticipated for weeks. My mom, exasperated, finally raised her hands, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Benjamin, how did you even?" Her words faltered because she didn't have an answer. My sister, fuming, stomped over to the pantry, realizing for the first time that her meticulously planned morning had been quietly disrupted, and the results were entirely intentional. My dad muttered something about needing to rethink their assumptions, but even he understood that the dynamic had shifted in a fundamental, undeniable way. I smiled, quietly, politely, and said nothing. I let them stew in the realization that I had orchestrated everything. No shouting, no dramatics, no confrontation, just calm, methodical precision that left them scrambling to adapt. For decades, they had taken me for granted, assumed I would always comply, assumed I was replaceable. Now they understood, without a word from me, that assumption had been a mistake. By the time they left for the airport, the house was perfectly functional, clean, and well-maintained, but entirely on my terms. Every instruction, every expectation, every carefully constructed routine they had assumed I would follow without question had been subtly shifted, proving the point without breaking anything. The pets were fed, the plants watered, the pantry and kitchen perfectly arranged, but all according to the system I had designed, not theirs. And as the car drove away, leaving me in the quiet house, I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. I had executed my plan without drama, without conflict, without resorting to anger. My revenge wasn't loud or destructive. It was precise, undeniable, and deeply satisfying. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just Benjamin the responsible, the compliant, the invisible. I was Benjamin the capable, the strategic, the one who controlled outcomes without relying on confrontation or luck. I had proven to them, in the most undeniable way possible, that they could not take me for granted, that their assumptions, their favoritism, and their entitlement had limits, and that I was the one setting them now. I sat in the living room, listening to the quiet hum of the house, and allowed myself a long, slow breath. The revenge was complete. I had turned the tables, reclaimed my agency, and demonstrated my worth without a single raised voice. And in that silence, I finally felt free. Free from expectation, free from dismissal, free from a family that had underestimated me for too long. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't understood before. The most satisfying revenge isn't about chaos or confrontation. It's about control. It's about precision. It's about quietly, calmly, methodically reshaping the world so that those who underestimated you finally see the full measure of what you're capable of. As I looked around the house, everything in its place, but now on my terms, I smiled. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving in my family's shadow. I was thriving, and they had no choice but to acknowledge it, whether they wanted to or not. I'm Alexander, 36, and if you'd asked me a week ago how a perfectly normal family event could descend into utter chaos, I would have laughed. Now, after what happened, I'm questioning every single decision I've ever made about family. To start from the beginning, my father has always been demanding, controlling, really, with a heavy dose of self-importance that makes you feel like nothing you do is ever enough. My aunt, on the other hand, has perfected the art of snapping at everyone around her, like the world exists solely to serve her whims. And me? I'm just Alexander, the one who's always tried to keep the peace, the one who always ends up being the responsible adult when everyone else throws a tantrum. But after what happened last weekend, I've realized trying to be reasonable with unreasonable people is a wasted effort. It all started with what was supposed to be my son's bar mitzvah. My son, Jonah, is 17, and he's a bright, independent kid, intelligent, polite, and perhaps too good at following directions. My parents had, of course, made it clear from the very beginning that this wasn't just any ceremony. In their world, the family had to make a grand showing of authority, control, and perfection. The hall had to be immaculate, the guests had to arrive on time, and Jonah had to follow every instruction without question. I had already argued with my father multiple times about giving Jonah any autonomy, but, as always, my protests were met with that dismissive nod of his, the one that meant, "You'll see. You'll just do what I say anyway." The night before the ceremony, my father called me into his office. He was holding a thick envelope, which I recognized immediately as the finalized itinerary for the following morning. He handed it to me like it was a weapon. "Pack all the luggage by midnight," he barked, his voice like steel wrapped in impatience. I blinked, startled by the sudden aggression. Luggage? For Jonah? For a morning ceremony? I opened my mouth, but before I could say anything, my aunt appeared at the doorway, tapping her manicured fingers against the frame. "And don't forget anyone," she snapped, like I was personally responsible for the entire extended family being accounted for. I tried to take a deep breath and process what they wanted. It was late, nearly 11, and I had been running around all day helping with last-minute preparations. But Jonah was a good kid, and I knew he could handle packing his own things if he was asked reasonably. I glanced at him sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, earbuds in, blissfully unaware of the chaos building around him. He just looked up when my father barked at him next. "Got it," he said quietly, nodding. That single nod, so small and polite, made my chest tighten. I wanted to protect him from this madness, shield him from their endless expectations, but I knew I couldn't. Not if I wanted to avoid my father's wrath. I spent the rest of the night helping with what felt like endless tasks, ironing clothes, double-checking the list of guests, making sure every detail matched the strict demands outlined in the itinerary. Meanwhile, Jonah retreated to his room, quietly preparing in his own methodical way. It was like watching a storm brew, knowing it was coming for him, and yet feeling powerless to stop it. Every time I peeked into his room, he looked calm, collected, almost serene in the face of the absurd expectations surrounding him. I envied him that peace. Morning arrived, and the house was buzzing. My father was pacing, mumbling to my aunt about how the luggage should be perfectly organized, down to the socks and ties. I tried to intervene gently. "Maybe we can just," but my words were cut off by a sharp, "Alexander, don't waste time. Just make sure it's done." Jonah appeared at the bottom of the stairs, backpack slung over one shoulder, looking at all the chaos with a quiet disbelief. I could see him holding back a sigh, the kind only a teenager forced to navigate adult absurdity could muster. We arrived at the venue around 10 in the morning, and that's when the tension exploded in a way I had not anticipated. Guests were milling about, chatting and laughing, carrying small gifts and cameras, expecting a cheerful celebration. Over 50 people had arrived to see Jonah, to watch him step into this momentous occasion, only to find the ceremony hall empty and, most shockingly, my son nowhere in sight. Confused whispers rippled through the crowd like a wave. Someone asked the coordinator where Jonah was. Another guest, a distant cousin, looked at me and my father incredulously. He's not here." My father's face shifted through a series of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, anger, all simmering just below the surface. My aunt's voice cut through the murmurs, shrill and sharp. "This is unacceptable. How could he possibly be missing?" She stomped toward the empty hall, shaking her head, clearly considering calling the entire neighborhood to track him down. I felt my stomach drop, a sinking realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Or perhaps, Jonah had done something I hadn't anticipated. I could feel my own frustration building. I had followed every instruction to the letter. I had made sure the luggage was packed, every name on the itinerary accounted for. I had done everything I could to ensure this event went smoothly. And yet here we were, chaos incarnate, with family members whispering accusations, eyes darting back and forth between me, my father, and the empty hall. My father, who had handed all this responsibility over to me and my son, now looked at me like I was the cause of this disaster. And then, just as the murmurs grew louder and the tension thickened, Jonah appeared. Not walking toward the hall, not with an apologetic smile, not at all. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, watching the family scramble, his expression unreadable. A moment of silence stretched, heavy and electric. Guests turned, staring at him as if he were the storm incarnate itself. The very reason their mourning had become a spectacle of confusion and disappointment. My father opened his mouth, probably to bark another command, but no words came. My aunt's hand went to her chest in shock, her face paling, and I felt something shift in the air, like a dam had burst and no one knew where the water would go. I wanted to scream at him, ask him what on earth he was doing, but I caught his eye, and there was something in his expression that stopped me cold. It wasn't fear or guilt or even nervousness. It was calm. It was deliberate. And deep down, I realized that whatever Jonah had done, he had planned it with intention. He wasn't just a kid who had forgotten his duty. He was someone asserting himself in a family that had never given him the space to do so. After the initial shock of seeing Jonah standing at the edge of the crowd, the room descended into what can only be described as controlled chaos. Guests murmured nervously, looking between my father, my aunt, and me, trying to figure out if this was some kind of bizarre misunderstanding or if we'd all lost our collective minds overnight. I could feel the heat crawling up my neck, a combination of embarrassment, frustration, and a creeping dread that maybe, just maybe, things were about to spiral entirely out of control. I hadn't anticipated that the morning would end like this, and, honestly, part of me wanted to disappear into the nearest empty corner. But disappearing wasn't an option, not when my son's quiet defiance had just turned our carefully curated family spectacle into a full-blown nightmare. My father, who had been pacing back and forth like a caged lion, finally turned his attention to Jonah. His voice was sharp, almost trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Jonah, what are you doing standing there? This is your ceremony. Why aren't you inside?" His words carried the weight of years of control, an expectation that obedience was not optional. My aunt, never one to let an opportunity for drama slip away, swooped in, her tone shrill and accusatory. "This is completely unacceptable. How could you be so selfish, Jonah? After all the effort your father and I have put into this, you—" She broke off mid-sentence when she caught my gaze, like she realized I wasn't just going to silently condone her tirade. I felt my stomach tighten. I had anticipated Jonah would resist the relentless demands of my parents in small ways, perhaps a sarcastic comment or a delayed response. But this was different. He wasn't just resisting. He was orchestrating a moment that forced every single person to confront the absurdity of the situation. And in that orchestrated defiance, he had something to teach. Not just me, but the entire family. "What's going on?" I finally managed to ask, my voice steady, though inside I was shaking. I wasn't trying to mediate, not really. I was trying to make sense of the surreal moment unfolding in front of me. Jonah turned to me slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "I packed my things last night, like you asked, but I didn't pack anyone else's. I didn't bring the suitcases, the gifts, or any of the other stuff you guys obsessed over. I just didn't." His words were quiet, measured, almost casual, and yet they hit like a punch to the gut. I froze. My parents had insisted that every detail be handled perfectly, that every single item be accounted for, that every expectation be met. And here was my son, standing before 50 guests, admitting he had ignored every single one of their impossible demands. My father's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen since I was a teenager being scolded for minor infractions, and my aunt's hand flew to her mouth, as though she might faint. Guests whispered furiously, eyes darting between Jonah, me, and my parents. My father's jaw clenched, and for the first time, I saw an almost childlike frustration in him, helplessness at being ignored. "Alexander, explain this," my father demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "This was your responsibility. You were supposed to make sure everything was done. Did you let him do this?" His words weren't a question. They were an accusation, directed straight at me, like I was the one responsible for Jonah's deliberate disobedience. My aunt chimed in, practically yelling now, her voice rising over the murmurs of the confused crowd. "You've completely failed, Alexander. How could you let him embarrass the family like this?" I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain that I had followed every instruction, but the words felt hollow. No matter what I said, nothing would undo the spectacle that had already occurred. Every guest had seen it. Every whispered conversation had already started. And the worst part? My father's expectations, the ones that had seemed so reasonable to him but were impossible for anyone else to meet, were now turned against me. I felt a surge of helpless rage, my throat tight, my hands trembling. Jonah's calmness, his composure, made the tension even more unbearable. It was as if he had already won some unspoken battle. Then came the subtle but unmistakable favoritism. My father, glaring at Jonah, muttered something under his breath, a barely audible comparison to his older son, Daniel, who had always been obedient and perfect. My aunt didn't hold back, loudly lamenting that Daniel would have never dared act so irresponsibly, implying, in front of everyone, that Jonah was somehow flawed or ungrateful. Every whispered remark, every sly glance, every subtle insult seemed to pile onto Jonah, weighing the room down with a toxic, suffocating energy. I could feel Jonah's posture stiffen, though his gaze never wavered. I knew him well enough to recognize that he was holding himself together, keeping his expression neutral, But I also saw the small tension in his jaw, the slight tightening of his hands at his sides. He wasn't just standing there. He was enduring a storm of entitlement, criticism, and expectation that could have broken almost anyone. My own frustration with my parents grew with each passing moment. I wanted to step forward, to put an end to their nonsense, but I also recognized that whatever my son had planned, it was intentional. Interfering might ruin it, and perhaps Jonah needed them to see exactly what their control had done. It was at that moment that the first cracks of betrayal began to form. My sister, whom I had always trusted to remain neutral in family disputes, stepped forward. "Jonah," she said softly, but with an edge that made my stomach turn, "why are you doing this? Dad and Aunt have worked so hard for today. You're making everything worse." Her words weren't just a plea. They carried judgment, an implicit approval of my father's authority over Jonah. My heart sank. She had always been the mediator, the one who tried to balance the family scales. Now she had chosen a side, against her own nephew. I could see the disappointment in her eyes, the way she had bought into the narrative that Jonah's defiance was a personal failure rather than a justified act of autonomy. Jonah's response was barely audible, a quiet, firm, almost heartbreaking. "I just wanted to be treated like a person, not a checklist." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and accusing. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in silent sympathy, others still confused by the escalating family tension. My father's face darkened further, a storm brewing behind his eyes, while my aunt shook her head in disbelief, muttering about the embarrassment and the ruined reputation. And then came the moment that truly broke the dam. Daniel, my older son, Jonah's half-brother, appeared at the hall entrance, carrying a smug expression and a carefully timed sense of superiority. He had somehow arrived early, dressed immaculately, and as he stepped into the room, he delivered the final blow. "I guess Jonah couldn't manage a simple itinerary. Don't worry, Dad, I've handled it." My sister's eyes lit up with approval at Daniel's words, and I could feel the betrayal of family alliances solidifying around me. Jonah's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flashing briefly with hurt and anger. Every whispered compliment toward Daniel, every subtle glance, every nod of approval from the relatives toward the older, perfect son, cut through Jonah's carefully maintained composure like knives. I could feel my own chest tighten with a mix of anger and helplessness. The favoritism wasn't subtle anymore. It was blatant, cruel, and intentionally humiliating. The air in the room felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of entitlement and expectation. Jonah, who had dared to stand up and assert himself, was now being surrounded by family members who had collectively chosen to shame him for daring to exist on his own terms. And yet, through it all, Jonah remained calm. I watched him, my chest aching, and realized something terrifying and liberating at the same time. This wasn't just about the ceremony. This was about long-standing patterns of control, entitlement, and manipulation, all converging on a single, pivotal moment. My parents' obsession with perfection, my aunt's relentless criticism, my sister's betrayal, Daniel's smugness. All of it had created a perfect storm. And Jonah, in his quiet, deliberate way, had chosen to confront it head-on, forcing the family to reckon with the consequences of their behavior. The whispers of the guests grew louder, the tension in the room so thick it was almost tangible. My father's face, red with rage, began to twitch slightly, his voice tight as he attempted to regain control. My aunt, hovering at his side, muttered something about calling everyone to leave if Jonah didn't comply. And yet, Jonah didn't move. He stood his ground, the calm in the center of the chaos, like the eye of a storm. I wanted to cry, to scream, to do something, anything, to protect him from the unfairness of it all. And deep down, I knew that whatever was about to happen next would change everything, for all of us. Because in a family like ours, betrayal wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it came in the form of a trusted ally siding with the entitled, the greedy, or the controlling. And that betrayal, subtle but deadly, had just fully revealed itself. After the debacle at the ceremony, the following days were a blur of anger, shame, and helplessness. I remember driving home from the hall that morning, the city blurring past the windshield like a smear of colors, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly I could feel the tension in my knuckles. Jonah sat in the passenger seat, quiet, headphones in, seemingly untouched by the chaos he had orchestrated. And yet, when I glanced at him, I could see the subtle lines of stress around his eyes, the tension in his jaw that no one else would have noticed. He had done what he thought was right, but the fallout, the fallout, was crushing. Back at home, my father refused to speak to me, not because of Jonah's actions, but because I had allowed them. My aunt, meanwhile, had made her way through the house, loudly complaining about the embarrassment, muttering under her breath about ruined reputations and wasted time. Guests from the ceremony called, texts and emails piling up, some sympathetic, some confused, some subtly judgmental. I felt like I was sinking into a pit of responsibility I had never asked for, one my family had meticulously constructed around me. My sister avoided eye contact. Daniel's smug behavior didn't stop, and every corner of the house seemed to echo with the chorus of everyone else's superiority. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with anger, disappointment, and a creeping sense of failure. I kept replaying the morning over and over, wondering what I could have done differently. Could I have intervened with Jonah? Could I have prevented the humiliation? Should I have, stood up to my father and aunt earlier? Each thought was a needle, pricking at my sense of self, leaving me raw and exhausted. I began questioning everything, my role in the family, my judgment, and even my own worth. Jonah, of course, seemed unshakable. He moved through the house as if nothing had changed, quietly tending to his own routines, calmly doing his homework, and occasionally glancing at me with a look that said, "You're not alone in this." But even his composure highlighted my own crumbling confidence. I had always been the reliable one, the stabilizer, the person who ensured family events went smoothly. Now, I realized that reliability had been a trap, one that kept me chained to their endless expectations, one that rewarded compliance and punished independence. I had been so focused on doing everything right that I had forgotten to ask myself what right actually meant. For the next few days, I withdrew. I avoided my father's calls, ignored my aunt's incessant messages, and limited interactions with relatives who seemed eager to discuss the catastrophe at the ceremony. I spent hours in my office, staring at the computer screen, not because I was working, but because I needed an escape from the relentless noise of entitlement that had always surrounded me. I felt small, trapped, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, but only partially, leaving me dangling in midair. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, only that I could no longer operate under their rules, and yet I didn't know how to break free entirely. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that I realized something crucial. The only person whose approval I truly needed was my own. The people who had made me feel like a failure, my father, my aunt, even my sister, were not entitled to dictate my worth. Their favoritism, their insults, their manipulations, they reflected them, not me. And if I could internalize that truth, if I could really embrace it, I could begin to rebuild the life they had spent years trying to control. I started small. I began organizing my own projects, things I had put off for years because they weren't worthy of attention in the family hierarchy. I enrolled in online courses I had been interested in, started researching ways to expand my small business, and even reached out to a few trusted friends who had always encouraged me to prioritize my own goals over family expectations. Each small step was like putting another brick in a wall I was building around my sense of self, a wall that wasn't about isolation, but about protection and reclaiming agency. Jonah was my quiet partner in this rebuilding. While he hadn't participated directly, he offered counsel and perspective in his own calm, deliberate way. One evening, as I wrestled with the overwhelming pressure of starting a new project, he leaned over and said, "You've spent too long trying to make them happy. You need to make yourself happy first. Otherwise, nothing else matters." Simple words, but they hit me like a hammer. I realized he had always understood the dynamics better than anyone in the family, even me. He had seen the toxicity, understood it, and chosen a path of measured resistance. And now, seeing him model that quiet strength, I began to understand that I could do the same. The transformation wasn't immediate. There were days when I still felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on me, when I wanted to throw everything away and disappear. My father's messages demanding explanations, my aunt's sharp remarks, my sister's subtle scoldings, they continued, like persistent shadows I couldn't shake. But I began responding differently. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I started setting boundaries, politely but firmly, and noticed how disoriented they became. They were used to compliance, to having their expectations met without question. When I began saying no, when I started asserting myself, it created a ripple of discomfort, one that I realized I could use strategically. Slowly, I began to focus on success outside of their influence. I restructured my small business, invested time in projects that reflected my true interests, and connected with communities that valued me for my abilities, not my willingness to follow orders. With each small victory, I felt a spark of self-worth reignite. Jonah noticed it too, often commenting on my progress with quiet pride. It was empowering, but it also reminded me how much I had allowed myself to be diminished over the years. The family, of course, noticed the change. My father would make subtle remarks, attempting to undermine my confidence, but I no longer internalized them. My aunt tried to guilt me into compliance through passive-aggressive notes and constant reminders of the family duty I was supposedly shirking. Even my sister continued to offer veiled criticisms, but each attempt only reinforced my growing sense of independence. Their power over me had always been rooted in my own compliance. Now that I refused to comply blindly, their influence began to weaken. I also started documenting everything: their entitlement, their favoritism, the manipulations that had shaped my life and Jonah's. Every unreasonable demand, every subtle insult, every act of betrayal was cataloged carefully, not to confront them immediately, but to have a record, a proof of patterns, a way to reclaim power when the time was right. It was both therapeutic and strategic, a quiet preparation for the moment I would no longer be at their mercy. And as I rebuilt, I began noticing something remarkable: the quiet respect of those outside the family who saw me not as a pawn, but as a capable, intelligent person. Friends, colleagues, even casual acquaintances began acknowledging my skills, my judgment, my patience. That recognition was intoxicating in a way I hadn't realized I had been starving for my entire life. It made me realize that the world outside my family wasn't governed by entitlement, favoritism, or constant judgment. It was governed by merit, by respect, and by authenticity, things I had been neglecting in the pursuit of their impossible standards. I won't lie, there were moments of doubt. Nights when I wondered if I had made a mistake, days when the weight of their expectations threatened to crush me. But slowly, piece by piece, I began to reclaim my identity. My sense of self grew stronger, more resilient, and more independent. Jonah and I, side by side, began building a life where we weren't defined by the whims of others, where our accomplishments, our choices, and our values were our own. By the time the following months rolled around, I had hit a point where the old family dynamics no longer held sway over me. I was more confident, more assertive, and more capable of protecting myself and Jonah from the cycles of entitlement and favoritism that had dominated our lives. But even as I stood stronger, I knew that the battle wasn't over. My parents and relatives still wielded influence, still tried to manipulate, and still underestimated what Jonah and I were capable of. The tension between our independence and their obsession with control remained a simmering force, waiting for the perfect moment to explode. And that's when the next stage began to form in my mind. I realized that rebuilding wasn't enough. Surviving wasn't enough. If I truly wanted to reclaim not just my life, but my dignity, my son's respect, and our shared future, I would need to confront the family head-on. Carefully, strategically, and in a way they could never ignore or dismiss. The groundwork was being laid quietly, patiently, and with purpose. After months of rebuilding myself and regaining some measure of independence, I began to see the family for what they truly were, not just flawed, but predictable. Every glance, every word, every expectation they laid down followed the same patterns they had used for years. And once I realized this, a plan began to form in my mind. Not a hasty, angry reaction, but a deliberate, calculated strategy that would expose the family for exactly who they were while ensuring Jonah and I finally had the upper hand. I didn't want chaos like last year's ceremony. I wanted precision. I wanted justice that was both satisfying and undeniable. The first step was observation. I spent weeks quietly watching my father, noting his routines, habits, and predictable responses to stress. He had a tendency to over-prepare, to micromanage everything down to the smallest detail, and to react with dramatic outrage when things didn't go according to his plan. My aunt was even easier to anticipate. She thrived on attention and control, loved drama, and had a severe case of performance obsession. Every call, every complaint, every attempt to manipulate me or Jonah reinforced the patterns I had already cataloged. My sister, unfortunately, had proven herself as someone who would betray when convenient, so I made sure to keep her at arm's length while still maintaining a cordial relationship. It would serve later when she underestimated what I was capable of. Jonah became my quiet partner in this, though he rarely spoke more than necessary. He would observe alongside me, noting family weaknesses, the little cracks in their armor that I had missed over the years. Sometimes, I would catch him smiling faintly as my father ranted about things that didn't matter or as my aunt fumed over imagined slights. He had grown remarkably adept at reading people, and his calm presence reminded me that I was no longer alone in this. Together, we began to outline the opportunities, the weaknesses, and the moments where the family's sense of superiority could be turned against them. It was subtle at first. I started small, testing boundaries, seeing how far I could push before encountering resistance. A delayed response to my father's incessant instructions. A carefully framed disagreement with my aunt that forced her to justify her unreasonable demands. Each small act was measured, calculated, a way of strengthening my confidence while teaching the family that Jonah and I were no longer predictable. Guests at family events began to notice the change in demeanor, some in admiration, some in confusion. The power balance was shifting, almost imperceptibly, but unmistakably. I also began to gather allies. People outside the immediate family who had witnessed the years of entitlement and manipulation. Close friends, colleagues, even a few distant relatives who had grown tired of the family's toxic patterns. They weren't just supporters, they were witnesses. I realized that part of my plan needed credibility. It wasn't enough for Jonah and me to succeed in our private victories. We needed the family to see, to feel the consequences of their actions in front of others who could validate our perspective. Every interaction, every subtle disclosure, was designed to lay that foundation. Meanwhile, Jonah and I worked on logistics. I started cataloging financial details, family traditions, and moments of past favoritism that could be exposed when the time was right. Jonah helped create timelines, cross-referencing events to show patterns of manipulation and entitlement. It was meticulous work, almost like detective work, and it gave me a sense of control I had never had around my father and aunt. I realized that knowledge was the ultimate power, knowing the patterns, the weak points, the predictability of their reactions. And with that knowledge, I could plan an execution that was flawless. But it wasn't just about preparation. It was also about self-discipline. I refused to let my emotions dictate my actions. Every time my father or aunt tried to provoke me, I reminded myself that patience was essential. Jonah and I had to remain calm, deliberate, and measured. The smallest misstep could ruin everything. I began meditating in the mornings, practicing focus, and running scenarios in my head late at night. Each imagined encounter, each possible reaction, was weighed and analyzed until I could predict outcomes with frightening accuracy. The family, of course, continued their usual antics, oblivious to the storm quietly gathering. My father continued his overbearing micromanagement, instructing me and others with the same rigid intensity he had for years. My aunt continued her performance of authority, snapping at anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards. My sister continued to play both sides, never fully committing to any position, believing herself clever and untouchable. And Daniel, blissfully arrogant, remained the golden child, unaware that his perceived superiority was already being undermined. Each of them thought they were untouchable, that Jonah and I were still the predictable pawns they had always controlled. Their arrogance, as always, would be their undoing. The next part of the setup was subtle manipulation of events. I began arranging gatherings where the family's entitlement would become visible, where their attempts to assert control could be exposed. I orchestrated situations that mirrored past humiliations, but with a twist. They would now be revealed to the very people who had witnessed their behavior over the years. Guests, distant relatives, and friends who had long been silent observers would now see the patterns for themselves. Jonah and I quietly ensured that every interaction, every misstep, would be noted, recorded, or witnessed. It wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. It was exposure. Financial leverage also became part of the plan. Over the years, my parents had been careless in how they managed certain family assets, always assuming compliance and trust. I quietly examined these, noting opportunities to shift the balance in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious. I wasn't reckless, but deliberate, turning years of control and entitlement into tangible points of leverage that could not be ignored. I even consulted legal and financial advisors discreetly, ensuring that when the moment came, we would not just be morally right, but practically untouchable. Meanwhile, I observed their psychological weaknesses. My father thrived on appearances, desperate for recognition, unable to tolerate being seen as anything less than perfect. My aunt craved attention, easily flustered by public embarrassment or situations that undermined her authority. My sister's insecurity made her susceptible to manipulation when it seemed aligned with her self-interest. And Daniel's arrogance, while seemingly innocent, made him oblivious to threats, a flaw I could exploit. Every conversation, every interaction became a test. Every minor victory, every slip, was cataloged, analyzed, and stored for the right moment. Jonah's role grew steadily. His quiet defiance was a constant reminder to the family that we were no longer predictable. He began asserting himself in small ways, deliberately missing minor instructions, asking questions that exposed illogical expectations, making calm, precise observations that others ignored at first but began to notice over time. Each act was measured, deliberate, designed to build confidence, credibility, and anticipation for the eventual confrontation. His poise and intelligence became a source of strength for me, a confirmation that our plan was on track. I began to dream bigger. The bar mitzvah fiasco had been small in scale but enormous in consequence. Now, I considered larger, more intricate scenarios, situations where the family's entitlement, favoritism, and hypocrisy would be laid bare to the people whose opinions they valued most. Public gatherings, family meetings, carefully orchestrated events, all would serve as stages for the revelation of truth. But everything had to be precise. One misstep, one overly aggressive move, and the plan could collapse, leaving Jonah and me vulnerable once more. Patience and precision became my watchwords. The months of preparation also included emotional readiness. I knew I could not let anger dictate my actions. Every moment of restraint, every decision to remain calm in the face of provocation, strengthened my resolve. I learned to view my father's tantrums and my aunt's shrill commands as signals rather than threats, cues that guided the timing and placement of our next steps. I trained myself to respond with strategy rather than impulse, turning years of emotional abuse into tools for our eventual victory. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere around us began to shift. The family still believed they held power, still assumed compliance, still relied on their habitual dominance. They had no idea that the tides had turned, that Jonah and I had quietly built a structure of preparation, observation, and strategic leverage that would allow us to control the next phase of our interactions. They believed themselves untouchable, unassailable, immune to consequence. And in that belief lay their fatal flaw. The perfect opportunity, I realized, would not be created by anger, nor by a single dramatic act. It would be orchestrated with patience, with subtlety, and with the full weight of months of preparation. Jonah and I were ready to expose every act of entitlement, every betrayal, every favoring of one child over another, in a way that could not be dismissed. Every guest, every ally, every documented detail had been lined up, waiting for the moment we chose to reveal it. And in that quiet, patient readiness, I felt a sense of empowerment I had never experienced before. This was no longer about mere survival. This was about reclaiming respect, asserting justice, and demonstrating beyond a shadow of a doubt that our voices, our choices, and our dignity mattered more than their expectations, their manipulations, or their sense of entitlement. The pieces were in place, the stage was set, and the storm was ready to break, but only on our terms, in our time, and with precision that would leave them no room to deny the truth. The day finally arrived, and the culmination of months of careful observation, planning, and quiet maneuvering was about to unfold. The family had no idea how prepared Jonah and I were, how meticulously every detail had been orchestrated. I woke that morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Every nerve, every thought, every action was aligned toward the execution of a plan that would finally expose the entitlement, favoritism, and hypocrisy that had ruled our lives for so long. I looked at Jonah, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly equal to my parents. We weren't just surviving. We were about to rewrite the rules. The event was billed as a family gathering, a celebration of sorts, under the guise of a casual brunch. I had invited distant relatives, a few close friends, and even some of the business contacts who had quietly witnessed my parents' controlling behavior over the years. I wanted witnesses, not just for credibility, but to make the eventual fallout undeniable. The hall was neutral, elegant, and free from the emotional charge of the previous ceremony. Every detail was chosen to give us the upper hand. No surprises for Jonah, no last-minute demands from my father, and absolutely no distractions. The family arrived, blissfully confident. My father's posture was rigid, every step measured, as if the world were still his to command. My aunt was a storm of rehearsed elegance, checking hair, nails, and attire, muttering under her breath about how she should have supervised every aspect of the event. My sister floated in, her eyes darting, calculating, unaware that she would soon be caught in her own web of favoritism and betrayal. And Daniel, was smug, the embodiment of self-satisfaction, certain that the gathering was another stage for him to shine while Jonah and I simply existed in the shadows. I greeted them calmly, with deliberate warmth. No hints, no foreshadowing, just normalcy. I watched their expressions carefully, noting every flicker of surprise or suspicion, storing each in my mental ledger. Jonah stayed beside me, quiet, confident, an anchor of calm in the storm. The first interactions were deceptively ordinary, pleasantries, small talk, the subtle testing of boundaries. My father made a few casual comments about previous events, clearly fishing for confirmation of his authority. My aunt complained quietly about minor details in the setup, testing if her old tactics still held sway. And my sister, ever the opportunist, offered idle comments meant to curry favor, not realizing she was walking straight into the trap we had designed. The first move was subtle but devastating. I asked my father to help with a small logistical task, something he would normally insist on controlling entirely. When he complied, I quietly noted the action in front of the witnesses, framing it as an example of the meticulous control he had exerted over every family event for years. My aunt, naturally, objected, claiming the task was trivial, beneath her, and that it should have been handled by me. I calmly countered, explaining that this was exactly the type of overreach that had caused past chaos, subtly framing her behavior as the source of long-standing family tension. Guests glanced at each other, noticing the small but pointed observations. The next phase was even more precise. I had arranged for old documents, receipts, and records of previous family events to be displayed discreetly, items showing favoritism, financial mismanagement, and manipulation. My father and aunt were oblivious, still assuming their authority when unquestioned. One by one, I referenced them casually in conversation, exposing patterns of behavior that had always been brushed under the rug. "Remember last year's celebration?" I asked, with calm neutrality, letting the guests see the awkward glance my father exchanged with my aunt. I noticed how some children were given far more attention than others. I didn't need to elaborate. The implication was crystal clear. Jonah's presence added weight, his quiet nods reinforcing the points I made without a single word. Then came the strategic exposure of betrayal. My sister, who had sided against Jonah during the bar mitzvah fiasco, was quietly confronted. I referenced specific moments where she had actively chosen to support the entitled narrative, using subtle phrasing to highlight her alignment with favoritism rather than fairness. It's fascinating how much influence we give to appearances, isn't it? I said casually, glancing around. Even those who claim neutrality sometimes end up shaping outcomes in ways they don't even realize. Her face paled as the realization dawned. Everyone was witnessing her complicity. Daniel, predictably arrogant, was next. I orchestrated a scenario where he was given a small task in front of the guests, something requiring judgment and responsibility. He failed spectacularly, his overconfidence exposing every flaw my parents had ignored in their blind favoritism. I didn't need to comment. The witnesses saw it, laughed quietly among themselves, and shook their heads at the unmistakable display of entitlement failing under scrutiny. Jonah, ever the observer, offered a subtle smile, and I felt a quiet pride. The message was clear. The pedestal that had sheltered Daniel for years was crumbling. The crescendo came with a simple but devastating question. I had invited a distant relative who had long witnessed the family's toxic patterns, someone with no stake in the dynamics. Casually, I asked them to recount an event where favoritism and manipulation had been evident, an incident everyone in the room remembered but had never discussed openly. The relative did so with precision, recounting the details without exaggeration. Guests gasped quietly. The family fumbled for explanations. My father stammered. My aunt's hands trembled. My sister tried to recover with weak justifications. And Daniel looked completely lost. The calm, methodical exposure of truth left them stunned and disoriented. By the time dessert was served, the room had shifted entirely. Guests were quietly observing, some exchanging knowing glances, others whispering about the patterns now undeniable. My father, my aunt, my sister, and Daniel were trapped in the web they had spun for decades. Every act of entitlement, every betrayal, every favoritism they had exercised was now visible, undeniable, and undeniable to the people whose opinions mattered most. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Jonah and I were no longer invisible, no longer pawns, and no longer at their mercy. I leaned back in my chair, sipping a coffee, and watched as the family attempted to regain composure. My father's pride would not allow him to admit wrongdoing outright. My aunt's obsession with reputation prevented her from acknowledging the truth, and my sister's fear of losing credibility kept her silent. Daniel, still reeling from the public exposure of his arrogance, glared at me, helpless and humiliated. And through it all, Jonah remained beside me, calm, collected, and quietly triumphant. The final move was quiet but poetic. I addressed the room, carefully, with calm authority. It's been a long time coming, I said, my voice even. We've all grown used to certain patterns, certain expectations, and certain injustices. But patterns can be broken. Expectations can be challenged. And injustices, well, they can be confronted. I let the words linger, the weight of truth settling over the room. The guests, silent witnesses to years of manipulation and entitlement, nodded slowly, some offering quiet murmurs of agreement. The family, however, sat frozen, stunned into silence by the undeniable clarity of the moment. I didn't shout, I didn't lecture, I didn't plead. I simply let the carefully orchestrated exposure of truth speak for itself. The guests had seen the favoritism, the manipulation, the betrayal, and they knew who had endured it and who had caused it. My father's authority was shattered, my aunt's control exposed, my sister's duplicity laid bare, and Daniel's arrogance publicly humbled. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was quiet, precise, and devastatingly effective. When the last conversation had ended, when the guests had left, and the room was finally silent, Jonah and I shared a quiet smile. We had done it. No shouting, no chaos, just the calm, measured execution of a plan years in the making. The family's entitlement had been exposed to the people who mattered, their hypocrisy laid bare, and our dignity reclaimed. The storm had passed, leaving us standing, stronger than ever. As we gathered our things to leave, I felt an incredible sense of relief. The tension that had weighed on me for decades had finally been lifted. Jonah's hand brushed against mine briefly, a small but meaningful gesture that conveyed pride, solidarity, and shared victory. I realized then that the most satisfying part of the entire ordeal wasn't the humiliation of the family. It was the quiet reclaiming of our lives, our autonomy, and our self-worth. As we stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, I looked back at the hall, at the people we had quietly exposed, and felt a calm, profound satisfaction. I glanced at Jonah, who was smiling faintly, and I realized something powerful. We had not just survived. We had risen. And from that day forward, nothing would ever allow them to diminish us again. And in that moment, standing side by side, I knew this truth with absolute certainty. Some victories don't need chaos or shouting. Some victories, the most satisfying ones, are quiet, deliberate, and unforgettable.